What did the president mean when he said the deep state Justice Department? And does this administration believe that the deep state is a real thing, that there is this shadow government out there actively plotting to sabotage him?
What is deep state? Is it near Dollywood? Because I'm in, if it is. And
both the current guy in the White House and his son have been tweeting about the so-called deep state, which is a conspiracy theory that government employees loyal to Obama and Hillary are working behind the scenes to derail his presidency.
Some supporters of Trump, including Breitbart News, are now accusing the intelligence agencies of attempting to wage a deep state coup against the president. Meanwhile, some critics of Trump are openly embracing such activity, like Bill Kristol, the prominent Republican analyst who founded the Weekly Standard. He wrote on Twitter, obviously strongly prefer normal democratic and constitutional politics, but if it comes to it, prefer the deep state to the Trump state.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you.
You think you can push us off this because you can try to intimidate the director? You better think again, Mr. President. You've been around for 13 months. We've been around since 1908. I know how this game is going to be played. We're going to win.
Okay, I will say this, because it's a message I've got from people from the CIA. I know a lot of officers, I know a lot of agents, I've been in their homes, and they're really delivering this to you and to Donald Trump. These are people who have sacrificed a lot for this country. They go through into the CIA every day. They walk past that wall with 117. I get it. What's the message?
As a former government official, government's going to kill this guy.
If now, because he's the nominee for the party, and he's entitled to briefings from the CIA, for example, I said publicly, give him fake briefings. Pretend you're briefing him. Don't tell him anything.
Look, I think Obama was just as much a victim of this as Trump is now. Obama didn't come into office wanting to overthrow governments, but he overthrew Libya, he assisted in overthrowing Assad, and we were involved in the overthrow in the Ukraine. We're still occupying the Middle East. These were not initiatives that Obama had when he was elected, but I think he got pulled by the military-industrial complex and the intelligence community into these positions. He even helped cover up Saudi Arabia's involvement in 9/11.
What the hell is the deep state? Everybody's talking about the deep state.
What in the malarkey is a deep state? It seems like this is the buzzword of the week.
This theory of the deep state. But this, I mean, based on what the Oxford Dictionary says, which is, you know, it's a body of people, typically influential members of government agencies or the military, believed to be involved with the secret manipulation or control of government policy.
Yeah.
Is this
One
like
would think
scandal?
if this was real, if this was real, do you think he'd still be a sitting president right now?
Every time I turn on the TV, they're talking about the deep state. My friends are talking about the deep state. I don't know what the deep state is. I think I do. Is that a conspiracy thing? Is that one of those tinfoil hat things?
The former deputy director of the FBI, and parenthetically Mueller's deputy, confirmed in an interview last week the existence of the deep state and gave us a rare view as to how these guys think and what's going on. His name is Phil Mudd, and he served as deputy director to former FBI director Robert Mueller, the number 2 guy in the FBI. He said that the government is going to kill this guy.
As a former government official, government's going to kill this guy.
Meaning Trump. That's a direct quote. He said that the Trump's defense of Russian President Vladimir Putin has compelled federal employees at Langley, Foggy Bottom, CIA, and state to try to take Trump down.
Washington, D.C. is not really run by elected officials. It's run by bureaucrats, the contractors, the surveillance communities, the police agencies. And of course, over the years, that's actually grown now to where you have the Department of Homeland Security, which came into being after 9/11. The massive NSA, CIA operations that are spying on everything Americans do. Nothing is private anymore. That's being realized. What we call the government in Washington, D.C. is really not the government. In other words, when you vote and you elect someone, you're not really electing the government that runs things. There's a deeper government there. It's something which has been called the deep state.
An obscure, invisible group of core members of the establishment pulling the strings behind the scenes, working together, conspiring to make sure that they always get their way. Many people point to bureaucrats, government officials, retired officials, globalists, corporatists, secret societies, legislators, contractors, and even media personalities who manipulate and defend established government status quo policies as the foot soldiers in this deep state. And to me, this manipulation is exemplified every 4 years during presidential elections in the United States, especially around the topic of foreign policy. Many people don't know this, but George W. Bush ran as a non-interventionist, an isolationist in 2000. Barack Obama promised similar policies and ran on the ideas of peace, hope, and fricking change. Meanwhile, both have come out as bloodthirsty warhawks pushing failed foreign policy objectives that are ridiculously dumb and hurt our country, continuing those policies as if nothing has changed with every new president.
What are you talking about? I read the paper. I get USA Today. I get CNN. What are you talking about?
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
This parallel government, rogue government, shadow government, state within a state, deep state. What the hell are you people talking about?
This is not unique to the United States. The United States learned some of this from the British, who learned it in turn during the 19th century, where they were a dominant imperial power around the world. They cut their teeth on this stuff. The other major powers are definitely engaged and capable of these same types of operations. And small powers as well. Israel is an example. The CIA grew out of the OSS during World War II, which had been established during World War II. Its earliest years are interesting because the new president, Harry Truman, did not trust the OSS because he felt it was too dominated by parts of the Democratic Party that he didn't align himself with. So he abolished the OSS. Then they first created a smaller intelligence agency from the remains of the old OSS called the Central Intelligence Group. And that was focused on analyzing intelligence. It wasn't a covert operations agency. About 2 years after that, many of the agents who had worked on the covert operations side, the paramilitary warfare operations, black operations, that sort of thing, were re-established in an outfit called the Office for Policy Coordination. And this office, quote unquote, eventually grew to have about 5,000 agents in the early Cold War years. So the existence of this office was itself entirely top secret. It had no open existence at all. And it wasn't until some years later that the Office of Policy Coordination was folded into the CIA, and the CIA became an agency, I'm talking about the early 1950s now, that openly had both a clandestine black operations arm and an intelligence analysis arm.
The OPC was set up to organize propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action, sabotage, demolition, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance groups and support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world.
What happened at the end of World War II, when Truman disbanded the OSS, the covert operators were in the wilderness for a little while. And some of them had been leading Wall Street bankers and lawyers. And there's a certain logic there. because prior to the war, the people engaged in international trade and international law were a relatively small number of people, and they were the specialists in international affairs for the United States. So, for example, the man who was later to become chief of covert operations, black operations for the CIA, was a man named Frank Wisner, quite a prominent Wall Street lawyer. The man who later became the director of the CIA was Allen Dulles. His career prior to World War II was basically in international law and cutting deals of one sort or another with trade partners around the world. Some of the trade partners included fascists, some aspects of Nazi Germany or companies associated with Nazi Germany, Italy. Prior to the war in World War II in Poland, there had been a military dictatorship, a very authoritarian country. Allen Dulles was made part of his living by helping to finance deals that kept that government in power. And there's many other examples along the same lines. During the war, they went into covert operations for the U.S. government because they had some expertise in dealing with foreign countries. After the war, they went back to Wall Street for a short time. And then by the late 1940s, they were back in the intelligence complex, in the two examples that I mentioned, in leadership and management type roles.
From the beginning, the CIA was steeped in elitism. Its top leadership was made up mostly of Wall Street lawyers, while new recruits were sought through the top Ivy League universities. Gaddis Smith, a history professor at Yale, remarked that Yale has influenced the Central Intelligence Agency more than any other university, giving the CIA the atmosphere of a class reunion.
Does the military engage such task forces of undercover operatives to carry out off-the-record missions? The answer to that question is yes. That answer comes from a number of sources, including Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. As a colonel in the U.S. Air Force and Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Prouty worked from 1955 to 1964 as the liaison procuring military supplies, equipment, and logistics support for CIA Special Operations worldwide. In his 1973 tell-all, The Secret Team, Prouty discussed the inner workings of America's intelligence community, noting, "Sheep-dipped is an intricate army-devised process by which a man who is in the service as a full-career soldier or officer agrees to go through all the legal and official motions of resigning from the service. Then, rather than actually being released, his records are pulled from the Army personnel files and transferred to a special Army intelligence file. Substitute, but nonetheless real-appearing records are then processed, and the man leaves the service. He is encouraged to write to friends and give a cover reason why he got out. He goes to his bank and charge card services and changes his status to civilian, and does the hundreds of other official and personal things that any man would do if he really had gotten out of the service. Meanwhile, his real Army records are kept in secrecy, but not forgotten." This tactic was used, for example, in Project Heavy Green during the U.S. military participation in Vietnam in the 1960s. Restricted from deploying troops in Laos by the 1962 Geneva Accords, 48 Air Force personnel were instead sheep-dipped and deployed in Laos as civilian employees of Lockheed to service a bombing radar installation there.
Further on, concerning the realization of the Dulles-Jackson Korea's report's method of placing CIA agents throughout the government, quote, "Many of these people who have reached positions of great responsibility, I believe that the most powerful and certainly the most useful agent the CIA has ever had operates in just such a capacity within another branch of the government, and he has been there for so long that few have any idea that he is a long-term career agent of the CIA. Through his most excellent and skillful services, more CIA operations have been enabled to take place than can be laid at the feet of the agency, at the feet of any other, more legitimate agent. This was the plan and the wisdom of the Dulles idea from the beginning. On the basis of security, he would place people in all areas of the government, and then he would move them up and deeper into their cover jobs, until they began to take a very active part in the role of their own organizations. This is how the ST was born, the secret team. Today, the role of the CIA is performed by an ad hoc organization that is much greater in size, strength, and resources than the CIA has ever been visualized to be. So the first question I have here would be, how, quote, on the basis of security, unquote, would Allen Dulles, quote, place people in all other areas of the government?
Well, one of the first things that I realized was that it was Mr. Dulles' desire to have the office that General White asked me to create in the Air Force headquarters in order to create a focal point system. And as Mr. Dulles told me later, he said, I don't want various people from my agency going into the Pentagon and dealing with different people there, and therefore uncovering the activities of the CIA to a large number of people, because obviously such a ring would then proliferate to others, and if they wanted submarines, they'd have to bring in some Navy people, and if they wanted helicopters, they'd have to talk to some Army people. He said, I want a focal point. I want an office that's cleared to do what we have to have done, an office that knows us very, very well, and then an office has access to a system in the Pentagon, but the system will not be aware of what initiated the request. They'll think it came from the Secretary of Defense. They won't realize it came from the Director of Central Intelligence. So you see, the Dulles philosophy was to control the focal point area. This led then to the creation of focal point offices everywhere. And as I established this Tab 6 organization, we called it, in every major staff area within the Air Force, because that was my jurisdiction at the time, I would have cleared people, another focal point, you might say a sub-focal point, a person I could go to who had been given ahead of time the authority to do whatever it was that he was authorized to do. And we stressed that authorized business. He would have to be sure he had orders either from my office or directly up to the Chief of Staff, and that we knew what we were doing for CIA. Well, this leads to another step you might call breeding. We had to work with various agencies of the government, not just the Defense Department. We had to have contact points in the State Department, in the FAA, in the Customs Service, in the Treasury, in the FBI, and all around through the government, up in the White House. And gradually we wove a network of people who understood the symbols and the code names and the things we were doing and how we handled money, which was the most important thing. And then we began to assign people there who those agencies thought were from the Defense Department, but they actually were people that we put there from the CIA. This led to the creation of a system of powerful individuals, people whose jobs were quite dominant in some of these other agencies, especially after they'd been there 2 or 3 years, because we put them in there by talking to the top man, the cabinet officer or the head of the agency, and we'd say, this man is being placed here so that he can facilitate covert activities and so that he can retain the secrecy that's required, and he will keep you informed at all times. Well, in the bureaucracy, the top people move faster than anybody else, not the bottom people. And so the man we had explained that to maybe a year and a half earlier would be transferred or leave the government, but our man is still there. So 1 or 2 cycles of that, and that agency might not even know that guy was there anymore. They would, and I mean, what his origins were, they would think he was just another one of their own employees. And as a result, he became extremely effective, because if we wanted something done, I remember a rather very sensitive operation that I needed some information on, and I needed it from the FBI. I didn't go to the FBI. I went to this guy that we had planted, and he got it twice as fast and in a much better form than I would have gotten from the FBI, even though I was at that time working from the Office of Secretary of Defense. We had no trouble working with the FBI. It was just to facilitate it. Yeah. These people became very, very adept. By the same token, people that were employees of CIA, agents, were assigned even in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We had certain people there who were CIA employees. Ed Lansdale worked for CIA all his adult career. a person named Frank Hand worked there. Now, the people in the Pentagon thought they were ordinary military employees. They didn't realize, well, just to give you an example, Colonel Ensdale was a full colonel in the Air Force. That was his cover story. And he had been a full colonel for a few years. And the Air Force was promoting some men to general. The question came up, would Lansdale be eligible? And I told Mr. Dulles personally, I said, you know, you can make Lansdale a general if you just write a letter to General LeMay, because you're going to pay the bills anyway, and not the Air Force. A few days later, I got a call from General LeMay's office. He called me in, and he had the list of men that the Air Force was promoting to general. And as I recall, it was only 13 or 14 officers, and LeMay, being General LeMay, knew every one of them except one. I don't know who the hell he is. I'm not going to promote him to a general. And I said, well, don't you have a file on him? He said, yes. He opened it up, and the top letter was from Allen Dulles. I said, he's a very important man for Allen Dulles. It's okay, I'll promote him. Just like that. Well, that's a good way to get a promotion, you see. But that created a very important job within the structure of the Office of Secretary of Defense. Frank Hand had been there for years in the same way. Frank was a civilian of... I always wrote that he was the most important agent that the agency had, because he was operating daily and effectively as a member of the Office of Secretary of Defense. And you can think of the things that a person in that capacity can do when his home base really is CIA. Well, although people didn't believe this when they first heard it, there are assignments like that in the White House. There are assignments like that in the State Department. It's hard to tell the difference, you might say, between Bill Bundy, who was a longtime CIA employee, and McGeorge Bundy, who was in the White House with Kennedy. The two brothers certainly going to act side by side. They had the same goals and the same intentions. Well, there were many things that duplicated like that. So that it wasn't long before, and I'd say by the end of the 50s, early 60s, before we had spread through the government what I called a secret team, a group of people who really knew how to operate the CIA business. So when I say that this team was quite effective, it was very effective, very strong, handled a lot of money, worked all over the world, thousands of people were involved. And I know one time when I was speaking to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at that time General Lemnitzer, he said, you know, I've known of 2 or 3 units in the Army that were supporting CIA. He said, but you're talking about quite a few. He said, how many were there? Well, at that time, there were 608. Well, General Lemnitzer had no idea of it. And it's amazing. Here's the top man in the military, and he had no idea that we were supporting that many CIA units. Not military units. They were phony military units. They were operating with military people, but they were controlled entirely. They were financed by the CIA. 608 of them. And I'm sure that from my day it increased. I know it didn't decrease. So people don't understand the size and the nature of this clandestine activity that is designed for clandestine operations all over the world. And it goes back again to things we've spoken of earlier, that activity must be under somebody's control. There is no law for the control of covert operations other than at the National Security Council level. And if the National Security Council does not sign the directives, issue the directives for covert operations, then nobody does. And that's when it becomes a shambles, as we saw in the Contra affair and in other things.
The deep state, what does that mean? So folks on the left, and I'm talking about guys who write for the New Yorker and The Nation, they make fun of it and say, oh, this is just a conspiracy theory. This is the sort of ravings of Steve Bannon trying to stir up people on Breitbart, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let me be very clear. The deep state is the same thing that President Eisenhower reminded people about when he talked about the military-industrial complex.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So if Eisenhower's warning in the 1950s was something we should take seriously, well then certainly 60 years later, we should be taking it seriously. And so there is this complex, right? There is a professional strata of people in the DC area principally who run the government day in, day out, frankly, decade in, decade out. And they're the professional staffs that man all the departments and agencies in town. And those folks don't roll over too often. They're usually there locked in for, a 20, 30-year career. They're the folks that are really the deep state. They are the long-term career professionals who do all the heavy lifting at all these different agencies.
First of all, I think it's the obligation of some executive branch officials to refuse to carry out some of these orders.
The people that run our government, they're called the Senior Executive Service, the SES grade. Used to be nicknamed super grades. They're above GS-15 level. They're the generals that never go away. They're the civilian clothes-wearing generals of the bureaucracy. They are the deep state, the SESs.
If people have to drive it, the senior leadership, if the SES, if there's ever any group that needs a collaboration video space in the federal government, it's the senior executives across the federal government. What I would like to see is, oh my God, what I would like to see is, it's great about going to the American public and we're dealing all this out. Get back in here. These people work for you. You're the president. Call them together. Don't meet with them once in a big room in, Constitution Hall, but start to collaborate with them because those are the people that hold the keys to the kingdom, the money, and the policies.
The real deep state is composed of over 8,000 managers in 75 different federal agencies. These are the senior executive service members, and Obama appointed about 7,000 of them. Now, because they're managers, they can tell new appointees what they can and cannot do. This puts the deep state in an unimaginable position of power. They're well organized, and as I just intuitively figured from the deep state, they stretch their roots into nearly all facets of the government. Now, when I was researching SES, I found this interesting guide to the Senior Executive Service from last March. Right in the introduction, they say members of the Senior Executive Service serve in key positions just below the top presidential appointees and are the major link between these appointees and the rest of the federal workforce. These leaders operate and oversee nearly every government activity in approximately 75 federal agencies.
And I can only assume Minnesota is not the exception. Did you know the CIA is implanted in your state government?
No.
How are they? Well, I'll explain. First of all, the CIA mission statement says they're not to be operational within the U.S. So they're violating their mission statement. Well, in Minnesota, only the governor and the chief of staff are aware of it. That there's an implanted CIA person in the Minnesota government at a level to where he doesn't come and go with elections. It's a permanent position. Why? Why do they violate their own mission statement? And I can only assume Arizona. I don't know if you have one, but I don't believe Minnesota is the exception.
Did you know who it was in Minnesota?
Yes.
And what was the position in Minnesota?
The position was at a deputy level in one of the, I won't go far enough to say, I won't say names because I'm not going to get Valerie Plain.
Was it an agency type position?
Well, it's an upper level management position. Okay. That's permanent. In fact, when this person retired, I was then introduced to the new one. They then recruited a new one. and had that person implanted in Minnesota government.
Sort of following on that, you write about them, Dulles being able to move them up and deeper into their covered jobs. Would this be a function of them being there longer than the people who would be promoted to something else in time?
Yes. When we put them in, they might be somebody's assistant. And they've been there for 3 years, and the man that was above them, who was probably a political appointee, leaves, and they might move this man up there. Or when a new political appointee comes, he has no knowledge that this man is really from CIA. He's just a strong person in his office, and he gives him a broader role. Sometimes these people were working. One man I know was in FAA, and we needed his work to help us with FAA as a focal point there. He had been there so long, the FAA had him in a very big, very responsible job, and you might say 90% of his work was regular FAA work, a very, very strong individual. Well, that meant that when we needed him to help us with some of our activities on the covert side of things, he was in a much better position to handle this than he had been originally. This happened with quite a few, and that's why I say in the case of Frank Hand, he had been in the Defense Department so long that he was able to handle really major operations that weren't even visualized at the time he was assigned. And this carries over into many other things. You know, I pointed out that the Office of Special Operations under General Erskine had the responsibility for the National Security Agency as well as CIA contacts and the State Department and so on. Well, as we filled up these positions, some of them became dominant in some of those organizations, such as NSA.
There are various layers. Another metaphor is an onion. You know, the top layer of the onion is the government and the Constitution. The next layer is the CIA and the NSA and now JSOC in the Pentagon, which is perhaps more sinister even than the CIA. And then you get another layer in my book, which is these private consulting companies, like I can say quite a lot about Booz Allen Hamilton, ostensibly a private company, but internationally they've been very in sync since 1953, when both of them started operating in the same countries. It was interesting that CIA went in to overthrow the government in Iran, and there was Booz Allen Hamilton. They developed a close relationship with Nasser. It was really done mostly through Booz Allen Hamilton. So these are private companies that are part of the power structure. And then we're on our way to the corporations and the banks that Booz Allen also do their business with.
So there's been a huge amount of discussion about the NSA spying scandal. You can't have missed it, but the conversation has been focused on Edward Snowden and the NSA. But Edward Snowden didn't actually work for the National Security Agency. He worked for a company called Booz Allen Hamilton, a large private American technology firm. So how can these leaks, which have exposed NSA wrongdoing, come from an employee of a private company? Well, when we started to look into it, we realized it's a pretty interesting story. So let's start first with the company themselves. It's been estimated that 99% of their income comes from government contracts. In 2012, they had a revenue of $5.86 billion, but 23% of their contracts come from America's intelligence community, which is made up of 17 different intelligence departments. You could say that Booz Allen Hamilton are specialists in winning government intelligence contracts. So how do they do that? Well, again, that's an interesting story. We'll start with this guy, Mike McConnell. Between 1992 and 1996, Mike McConnell was the director of the National Security Agency. So when Mike McConnell retired from the NSA, he was offered a job at, you guessed it, Booz Allen Hamilton. He brought with him all of his government contacts, and he was soon promoted to senior vice president of his new company. Well, Mike McConnell left Booz Allen Hamilton in 2007 because George Bush, who was president at the time, named him as the Director of National Intelligence. the Director of National Intelligence oversees the 17 members of America's intelligence community. Again, the very same community that Booz Allen specialize in servicing. That's people like the CIA, the NSA, and a whole bunch of agencies you've probably never heard of. They all report to the Director of National Intelligence, who reports back to and advises the President. At this time, McConnell was also the chairman of the board for the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. It's a public policy forum which, according to the Washington Post, was working to introduce a growing network of private contractors, large and small, to government intelligence agencies. And no one seemed to have a problem with this.
I plan to continue the strong emphasis on integration of the community to better serve all of our customers. That will mean better sharing of information, increased focus on customer needs and service, improved security processes, and deeper penetration of our targets.
So just 4 months after leaving Booz Allen Hamilton and starting his new job as Director of National Intelligence, one of Mike McConnell's staff was giving a presentation at an intelligence industry conference. And in the presentation was this slide. It literally marks the date of September the 11th and shows how contracts and spending increased dramatically after the event. The presentation also showed that 70% of the annual budget, which was $60 billion at the time, was spent on contracts with private firms. A later slide cheerily proclaimed, "We can't spy if we can't buy." Under McConnell, the total intelligence budget of the government, in case you're confused, increased from $63.5 billion in 2007 to $76.2 billion in 2009, after which he left the government and headed straight back to Booz Allen Hamilton, where he is still the vice chairman. Booz Allen Hamilton actually boast on their own website about the influence Mike McConnell had, saying, as the Director of National Intelligence, he managed the expansive National Intelligence Community, an organization of over 100,000 people, and an annual global enterprise budget of over $47 billion, and had extensive interactions with the White House, the President's Cabinet, Congress, international leaders, and the US business community. If you think the story ends there, then you're mistaken. The current Director of National Intelligence is a guy called James Clapper, and wouldn't you know it, he was previously an executive at Booz Allen Hamilton. He's the guy who sat in front of Congress and said this:
does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. Not wittingly.
So the people appointed to the highest positions in the American intelligence agencies go and work in the highest positions of American intelligence industries. Then they go back to government, and then they go back to the American intelligence industry. You have to wonder if these guys are able to set policy whilst they're in government, then exploit that policy financially whilst they're at a private company. And it isn't isolated to these two examples either. James Woolsey used to be the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's currently Senior Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton. Melissa Hathaway is a former executive at Booz Allen Hamilton. She used to work for Mike McConnell during the Bush administration. Richard J. Wilhelm, Executive Vice President of Booz Allen Hamilton. He was formerly Executive Director for Intelligence Community Affairs at the Central Intelligence Agency. But once again, the story does not end here. Booz Allen Hamilton is actually owned outright by a company called the Carlyle Group. And this is where things get even more bizarre.
For decades, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, has been the American governmental body tasked with conducting high-risk, high-payoff research into cutting-edge science and technology. responsible most famously for developing the world's first operational packet switching network that eventually became the core of the Internet. DARPA tends to garner headlines these days for some of its more outlandish research proposals, and is generally looked upon as a blue-sky research agency whose endeavors only occasionally bear fruit. In the post-9/11 consolidation of the American intelligence community, IARPA, or the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, was created to serve as the spymaster's equivalent of DARPA's defense research. In contrast to this, In-Q-Tel was formed by the CIA in 1999 as a private, not-for-profit venture capital firm with the specific task of delivering technology to America's intelligence community. Publicly, In-Q-Tel markets itself as an innovative way to leverage the power of the private sector by identifying key emerging technologies and providing companies with the funding to bring those technologies to market. In reality, however, what In-Q-Tel represents is a dangerous blurring of the lines between the public and private sectors, in a way that makes it difficult to tell where the American intelligence community ends and the IT sector begins. In-Q-Tel has generated a number of headlines since its inception based on what can only be described as the creepiness factor of its investments in overtly Orwellian technologies. In 2004, KM World published an interview with Greg Peeps, then In-Q-Tel's Senior Director of Federal and Intelligence Community Strategy, about some of their investments. Peeps was especially proud of the CIA's investment in Ingzite, a company that offered software for data mining unstructured data sources like blogs and websites with analytical processing. In 2006, it was revealed that AT&T had provided NSA eavesdroppers full access to its customers' internet traffic, and that the American intelligence community was illegally scooping up reams of internet data wholesale. The data mining equipment installed in the NSA backdoor, a Neris STA6400, was developed by a company whose partners were funded by In-Q-Tel. Also in 2006, News 21 reported on an In-Q-Tel investment in CallMiner, a company developing technology for turning recorded telephone conversations into searchable databases. In late 2005, it was revealed that the NSA had been engaged in an illegal, warrantless wiretapping program since at least the time of the 9/11 attacks, monitoring the private domestic phone calls of American citizens in breach of their Fourth Amendment rights. In 2009, The Telegraph reported on In-Q-Tel's investment in Visible Technologies, a company specializing in software that monitors what people are saying on social media websites like YouTube, Twitter, Flickr, and Amazon. The software is capable of real-time communications tracking, trend monitoring, and even sentiment analysis that categorizes blog posts and comments as positive, negative, or neutral. Just last month, the Federal Reserve tendered a request for proposal for just this type of software so the privately owned central bank could monitor what people are saying about it online. Two of the names that come up most often in connection with In-Q-Tel, however, need no introduction: Google and Facebook. The publicly available record on the Facebook In-Q-Tel connection is tenuous. Facebook received $12.7 million in venture capital from Excel, whose manager, James Breyer, now sits on their board. He was formerly the chairman of the National Venture Capital Association, whose board included Gilman Louie, then the CEO of In-Q-Tel. The connection is indirect, but the suggestion of CIA involvement with Facebook, however tangential, is disturbing in the light of Facebook's history of violating the privacy of its users.
Another black eye for Facebook. The social networking giant has reportedly revealed the sexual orientation of some users to advertisers. Researchers discovered that targeted ads are sent to accounts of people who have described themselves as gay or straight. Now that means a person who wants to keep their private life private may be actually sharing it. And just last week, we learned some of the most popular apps on Facebook were leaking users' information to advertisers.
Do you feel like it's a backlash, or do you feel like you're violating people's privacy? Do you feel like you're adequately portrayed as a... Because I want to wonder about the person who actually created this thing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff happened along the way. I think, there were real learning points and turning points along the way in terms of building things.
A recently released IM conversation between Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg and a friend revealed the underlying attitude of Facebook towards its users. The exchange took place in 2004 when Zuckerberg had recently started the popular social networking website. In it, he told the friend, quote, Yeah, so if you ever need any info about anyone at Harvard, just ask. I have over 4,000 emails, pictures, addresses, SNS. To which the friend replied, "What? How do you manage that one?" And Zuckerberg responded, "People just submitted it. I don't know why. They trust me. Dumb fucks." Google's connection to In-Q-Tel is more straightforward, if officially denied. In 2006, ex-CIA officer Robert David Steele told Homeland Security Today that Google had been taking money in direction for elements of the U.S. intelligence community, including the Office of Research and Development at the Central Intelligence Agency, In-Q-Tel, and, in all probability, both the National Security Agency and the Army's Intelligence and Security Command. Later that year, a blogger claimed that an official Google spokesman had denied the claims, but no official press statement was released. Steele's accusation is not the only suggestion of American intelligence involvement with Google, however. In 2005, In-Q-Tel sold over 5,000 shares of Google stock. The shares are widely presumed to have come from In-Q-Tel's investment in Keyhole Inc., which was subsequently bought out by Google, but this is uncertain. In 2010, it was announced that Google was working directly with the National Security Agency to secure its electronic assets. Also in 2010, Wired reported that In-Q-Tel and Google had jointly provided venture capital funding to Recorded Future Inc., a temporal analytics search engine company that analyzes tens of thousands of web sources to predict trends and events. But as potentially alarming as In-Q-Tel's connections to internet giants like Facebook and Google are, and as disturbing as its interest in data mining technologies might be, the CIA's venture capital arm is interested in more than just web traffic monitoring. The In-Q-Tel website currently lists two practice areas: information and communication technologies and physical and biological technologies. The latter field consists of capabilities of interest such as the on-site determination of individual human traits for intelligence community purposes, and tracking and/or authentication of both individuals and objects. In-Q-Tel also lists two areas that are on its radar when it comes to biotech: nanobioconvergence and physiological intelligence. Detailed breakdowns of each area explain that the intelligence community is interested in, amongst other things, self-assembling batteries, single-molecule detectors, targeted drug delivery platforms, and sensors that can tell where a person has been and what substances he has been handling from biomarkers like trace compounds in the breath or samples of skin. In the years since its formation, many have been led to speculate about In-Q-Tel and its investments. But what requires no speculation is an understanding that a privately owned venture capital firm, created by and for the CIA, in which well-connected board members drawn from the private sector can then profit from the investments made with CIA funds that itself come from the taxpayer, represents an erosion of the barrier between the public and private spheres that should give even the most credulous pause for thought. What does it mean that emerging technology companies are becoming wedded to the CIA as soon as their technology shows promise? What can be the public benefit in fostering and encouraging technologies which can be deployed for spying on all internet users, including American citizens, in direct contravention of the CIA's own prohibitions against operating domestically? If new software and technology is being brought to market by companies with In-Q-Tel advisors on their boards, what faith can anyone purchasing American technologies have that their software and hardware is not designed with CIA backdoors to help the American intelligence community achieve its vision of total information awareness? It didn't take long from the birth of the World Wide Web for the public to start using this new medium to transmit, collect, and analyze information in ways never before imagined. The first message boards and clunky Web 1.0 websites soon gave way to the blogosphere. The arrival of social media was the next step in this evolution, allowing for the formation of communities of interest to share information in real time about events happening anywhere on the globe. But as quickly as communities began to form around these new platforms, governments and militaries were even quicker in recognizing the potential to use this new medium to more effectively spread their own propaganda. Their goal? To shape public discourse around global events in a way favorable to their standing military and geopolitical objectives. Their method? The weaponization of social media. This is the Corbett Report. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, Reddit. Social media as we know it today barely existed 15 years ago. Although it provides new ways to interact with people and information from all across the planet, virtually instantaneously and virtually for free, we are only now beginning to understand the depths of the problems associated with these new platforms. More and more of the original developers of social media sites like Facebook and Twitter admit they no longer use social media themselves and actively keep it away from their children. And now, they are finally admitting the reason why. Social media was designed specifically to take advantage of your psychological weaknesses and keep you addicted to your screen.
You know, if the thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them to really understand it, that thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you, you know, more likes and comments. I mean, it's a social validation feedback loop that it's like it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. And I think that the inventors, creators, you know, and it's me, it's Mark, it's Kevin Systrom at Instagram, it's all of these people, understood this consciously, and we did it anyway.
It should be no surprise, then, that in this world of social media addicts and smartphone zombies, the 24/7 newsfeed is taking up a greater and greater share of people's lives. Our thoughts, our opinions, our knowledge of the world, even our mood are increasingly being influenced or even determined by what we see being posted, tweeted, or vlogged. And the process by which these media shape our opinions is being carefully monitored and analyzed, not by the social media companies themselves, but by the US military.
When the world's largest social media platform betrays its users, there's going to be outrage.
It was a study to see whether Facebook could influence the emotional state of its users on that news feed.
It allowed researchers to manipulate almost 700,000 users' news feeds. Some saw more positive news about their friends, others saw more negative.
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, we're all kind of lab rats in the big Facebook experiment.
But it wasn't only Facebook's experiment. Turns out the psychological study was connected to the U.S. government's research on social unrest.
This is really kind of creepy.
Yeah. And it gets worse. What you may not know is that the U.S. Department of Defense has reportedly spent roughly $20 million conducting studies aimed at learning how to manipulate online behavior in order to influence opinion. The initiative was launched in 2011 by the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, otherwise known as DARPA. The program is best described as the U.S. media's effort to become better at detecting and conducting propaganda campaigns via social media. Translation: when anti-government messages gain ground virally, Washington wants to find a way to spread counter-opinion.
The DARPA document that details the Pentagon's plans for influencing opinions in the social media space is called Social Media in Strategic Communication. DARPA's goal, according to their own website, is to develop tools to help identify misinformation or deception campaigns and counter them with truthful information. Exactly what tools were developed for this purpose and how they are currently being deployed is unclear, but Rand Walsman, the program's creator, admitted last year that the project lasted 4 years, cost $50 million, and led to the publication of over 200 papers. The papers, including Incorporating Human Cognitive Biases in a Probabilistic Model of Retweeting, Structural Properties of Ego Networks, and Sentiment Prediction Using Collaborative Filtering, make the thrust of the program perfectly clear. Social media users are lab rats, being carefully scrutinized by government-supported researchers, their tweets and Facebook posts and Instagram pictures being analyzed to determine how information spreads online, and, by implication, how the government and the military can use these social media networks to make their own propaganda go viral. As worrying as this research is, it pales in comparison to the knowledge that governments, militaries, and political lobby groups are already employing squadrons of keyboard warriors to wage information warfare in the social media battle space.
The Pentagon's got a new plan to counter anti-American messages in cyberspace. It involves buying software that will enable the American military to create and control fake online personas, fake people essentially, who will appear to have originated from all over the world. The plan is being undertaken by CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, and the objective of the online persona management service is to combat enemy propaganda by influencing foreign social media websites. CENTCOM has hired a software development company called Intrepid, and according to the contract, the California-based company will initially provide 50 user licenses, each of which would be capable of controlling up to 10 fake personas. U.S. law forbids the use of this type of technology called sock puppets against Americans, so all the personas will reportedly be communicating in languages like Arabic, Persian, and Urdu.
So is it okay to have the government monitor social media conversations and then to wade in and correct some of those conversations? With more on this, let's go to technology expert Carmi Levy. He's on the line from Montreal. Carmi, do you think the government's monitoring what you and I are saying right now? Is this whole thing getting out of line or what?
It opens up a bit of a question. I'd like to call it a Pandora's box of, what exactly is the government's aim here? And what do they hope to accomplish with what they find out? And as they accumulate this information online, this data on us, where does that data go? And so, I think as much as we should applaud the government for getting into this area, the optics of it are potentially very Big Brother-ish. And the government really does need to be a little bit more concrete on what its intentions are and how it intends to achieve this.
New evidence that government-owned computers at the Army Corps of Engineers office here in New Orleans are being used to verbally attack critics of the Corps comes in an affidavit from the former editor-in-chief of NOLA.com. John Donnelly, who was laid off this past February, tells us via satellite from Texas, in late 2006, he started noticing people presenting themselves as ordinary citizens, defending the Corps very energetically.
What stuck out, though, was the wording of the comments was in many ways mirroring news releases from the Corps of Engineers.
These commenters tried to discredit these people.
And when Rosenthal investigated, she discovered the comments were coming from users at the internet provider address of the Army Corps of Engineers offices here in New Orleans. She blamed the Corps for a strategy of going after critics.
In the process of trying to obscure the facts of the New Orleans floodings, one of their tactics was just verbal abuse.
Moetzet Yesha, in conjunction with My Israel, has arranged Instruction Day for wiki editors. The goal of the day is to teach people how to edit in Wikipedia, which is the #1 source of information today in the world. As a way of example, if someone searches the Gaza flotilla, we want to be there. We want to be the guys who influence what is written there, how it's written, and to ensure that it's balanced and Zionist in nature.
These operations are only the visible and publicly admitted front of a vast array of military and intelligence programs that are attempting to influence online behavior, spread government propaganda, and disrupt online communities that arise in opposition to their agenda. That such programs exist is not a matter of conjecture. It is mundane, established, documented fact. In 2014, an internal document was leaked from GCHQ, the British equivalent of the NSA. The document, never intended for public release, was entitled The Art of Deception, Training for a New Generation of Online Covert Operations, and bluntly stated that we want to build cyber magicians. It then goes on to outline the magic techniques that must be employed in influence and information operations online, including deception and manipulation techniques like anchoring, priming, and branding propaganda narratives. After presenting a map of social networking technologies that are targeted by these operations, the document then instructs the magicians how to deceive the public through attention management and behavioral manipulation. That governments would turn to these strategies is hardly a shocking development. In fact, the use of government shills to propagate government talking points and disrupt online dissent has been openly advocated on the record by high-ranking government officials for the past decade. In 2008, Cass Sunstein, a law professor who would go on to become Obama's information czar, co-authored a paper entitled Conspiracy Theories, in which he wrote that the best response to online conspiracy theories is what he calls cognitive infiltration of groups spreading these ideas. Government agents and their allies might enter chat rooms, online social networks, or even real space groups, and attempt to undermine percolating conspiracy theories by raising doubts about their factual premises, causal logic, or implications for political action. In one variant, government agents would openly proclaim, or at least make no effort to conceal, their institutional affiliations. In another variant, government officials would participate anonymously, or even with false identities. It is perhaps particularly ironic that the idea that government agents are actually and admittedly spreading propaganda online under false identities is, to the less informed members of the population, itself a conspiracy theory rather than an established conspiracy fact. Unsurprisingly, when confronted about his proposal, Sunstein pretended to not remember having written it and then pointedly refused to answer any questions about it.
My name is Bill DeBerg from Brooklyn College, and I know you wrote many articles, but I think the most telling one about you is the 2008 one called Conspiracy Theories, where you openly advocated government agents infiltrate activist groups of 9/11 Truth and also stifle dissent online. I was wondering, why do you think it's the government's job, or why do you think the government should go after family members who have questions about 9/11, responders who are lied to about the air, survivors whose testimony commits, and also government whistleblowers that were gagged because they released information that contradicts the official story? Why do you think the government should do that?
I think, as Ricky said, I've written hundreds of articles, and I remember some and not others. That one I don't remember very well. I hope I didn't say that. But whatever was said in that article, my role in government is to oversee federal rulemaking in a way that is wholly disconnected from the vast majority of my academic writing, including that.
I just want to know, is it safe to say that you retract saying that conspiracy theorists should be banned or taxed for having an opinion online? Is it safe to say that?
I don't remember the article very well, so I hope I didn't say either of those things.
But you did, and it's written. Do you retract them?
I'm focused on my job.
Now, a decade on from Sunstein's proposal, we know that military psyops agents, political lobbyists, corporate shills, and government propagandists are spending vast sums of money and employing entire armies of keyboard warriors, leaving comments and shaping conversations to change the public's opinions, influence their behavior, and even alter their mood. And they are helped along in this quest by the very same technology that allows the public to connect on a scale never before possible. Technology is always a double-edged sword, and sometimes it can be dangerous to wield that sword at all. There are ways to identify and neutralize the threat of online trolls and shills, but the phenomenon is not likely to go away anytime soon. Each of us must find our own answer to the question of how best to incorporate these technologies into our life. But the next time you find yourself caught up in an argument with an online persona that may or may not be a genuine human being, it might be better to ask yourself if your efforts are better spent engaging in the argument or just turning off the computer.
Is that we just have to be repetitive about this. It's not enough to simply have a catchy ad on a Monday and then only do it every Monday. We need to do this every day of the week and just really brainwash people.
Behind the State Department's $40 million troll farm, talking about something called the Global Engagement Center. Tell us what we know about this Global Engagement Center and the work that it does.
Well, like most evil things, I think, in the U.S. government, it came about ultimately through the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. As you no doubt remember, James, that gave us targeted assassinations of American citizens, unlimited detention without trial, et cetera, et cetera. So this was an initiative by the Obama administration to primarily at the time to counter jihadist propaganda, because we were all, as you know, rushing, James, to fight the jihad. without. And when the State Department said, "Hang on, stop doing that," and we said, "Oh, okay, we get it now." But seriously, that was the idea, to counter ISIS propaganda and counter Al Qaeda propaganda. But now, with the new defense strategy that Secretary Mattis put out earlier this year, we have realized now that actually, this past 13 years or so of fighting Al Qaeda, we're not doing that anymore. Now the enemy is China and Russia. And so this Global Engagement Center has got a shot in the arm because, surprise, surprise, the Pentagon has given it a financial shot in the arm to the tune of an additional $40 million to primarily focus on countering Chinese and Russian propaganda.
Yes, and just to point out the irony there for anyone that may have alluded, the idea that this was created to counter ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorist propaganda and is now being used against those dastardly Russians is particularly funny, or ironic at least, in the sense that, of course, it was the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians and Iraqis who were responsible for routing and getting rid of ISIS. So I think the irony there shouldn't be lost on anyone. But let's get deeper into the woods here. So what does it mean that the State Department is going to be attempting to, or is already, countering propaganda online? What form does that take, and what does that imply for the information or disinformation that we're seeing in the online space?
Well, I think for a few reasons we should find it extremely chilling. First of all, what qualifications does the State Department or any government agency have to determine what is foreign propaganda? If I'm a person in the State Department and I'm involved in a particular U.S. government policy, say it's support for a certain political party in Eastern Europe or something, or opposition to, and there's a media outlet like the Corbett Report or somewhere else that's skeptical about this, you're countering, you're opposing a State Department policy. Therefore, you could easily be labeled pushing foreign propaganda. After all, the Russians may also agree with you that this party or this movement is good or bad. So the whole idea that there's a government agency out there that will determine not which other government entities, but which private entities, American entities, American alternative news sources, if we disagree with the State Department line, well, we're opposing American policy. Therefore, we're propagandists and we need to be countered by our own government. If that's not chilling, I don't know what is.
It's the definition of chilling, in my opinion. But at least there's the fig leaf that, well, you're Americans in America, so theoretically the State Department can't really be doing anything against you, right? It's only against foreign propagandists like Canadians in Japan, like myself.
Well, you can be slimed, you can be slammed, you can be defamed. You can be as prop or not. We don't know what their source is. We don't know if they're a bunch of CIA guys. We have no idea who they are. But they call us Russian propagandists. They hurt our bottom line. As Trotsky said, to oppose the state is to die a slow starvation. That's how they kill you. They kill your ability to make a living doing what you're doing. And that is what they're doing. And look at the major media companies, the major social media companies. Google is in bed with the Pentagon. Amazon is in bed with the Pentagon. Facebook has close ties to the government, so they can use these tools to simply make us disappear, to put us in a virtual gulag. And James, I don't know about your numbers, but frankly, I'll be honest with you, our numbers have significantly declined this year. And it's not because we're putting out less cutting edge material. If anything, I think we're doing better than ever, telling the truth about our U.S. foreign policy. But somehow something is happening with algorithms. I don't know what it is, but we are being shadow banned, and I think we can attribute it to U.S. government involvement.
Yes, well, I can attest, yes, the Corbett Report, and I know other sites that were on that proper not hit list have been targeted and are absolutely losing Google search traffic. And that is continuing as they continue to adjust their algorithms. None of this should be particularly surprising to my viewers who, I hope, recently saw my recent report on the weaponization of social media and the admitted use of governments and militaries around the world, a use of social media, often in covert means, using covert agents, not identifying themselves as working for the the government as spreading information or disinformation online. So this is not a new phenomenon, but it is worrying, and it is part of this broader Russiagate fabric that is being woven right now. And as you say, it brings in things like Proper Not and Hamilton 68, which I know you go into in your report on the Liberty Report about this topic. Tell us a little bit about Hamilton 68, what it does, and who founded it.
This is extraordinarily important because it's part of the German Marshall Fund, which is largely funded by the U.S. government. So this is the U.S. government funding an organization. Hamilton 68 is a dashboard for your internet to let you know what the Russians want you to think about. So presumably you think about something else or else. But the whole idea is part of an organization within the German Marshall Fund that's headed up by people like Mike Morrell. Mike Morrell is a pissed off guy because he was going to be the head of the CIA under Clinton. You know, he was the acting CIA director under Obama, and he was going to be tapped to be CIA head. And doggone it, how dare Trump win? Deprives him of his the highlight, the peak of his career. But it's not only neocons like Morrell. It's Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol his organization is being funded by the U.S. government to tell the rest of us who's propaganda and who's not. This guy with a track record of zero being right about anything, but with an enormous neocon agenda. These are the people behind the scenes who are being entrusted with telling the Americans what they're allowed to watch and what they're not allowed to watch. And James, I'm sure you've probably looked at it. The other characters involved in Hamilton 68 are just as bad. Chertoff, this creep who made a fortune selling junky metal detectors to the airports after he created the phony color-coded terror alert to terrify everyone. So this is a very dangerous partnership between the nonprofit, non-government sector and the government itself.
Absolutely, and all of those characters definitely need more scrutiny and examination. And for people who are interested, just type in Chertoff Rapiscan into the Corbett Report search bar, and you'll find my previous reports on that swindle and all of these other characters. Bill Kristol, of course, should be laughed off the face of the planet by his, probably should be behind bars, but at any rate should be laughed off the face of the planet for the predictions about the Iraq War and how all that was going to pan out. And of course, people are still listening to him because now the new narrative is that we are back in the Cold War.
This is not some cabal that was hatched in the dark of night. This is something that hides in plain sight. It's something we know about, but we can't connect the dots, or most people don't connect the dots. It's kind of a natural evolution when so much money and political control is at stake in the most powerful country in the world. This has evolved over time.
And you call it the real power in the country.
Correct. It is a hybrid of corporate America and the national security state. Everyone knows what the military-industrial complex is, since Eisenhower talked about it in his farewell address. Everyone knows Wall Street and its depredations. Everyone knows how corporate America acts. They're both about the same thing. They're both about money, sucking as much money out of the country as they can, and they're about control, corporate control and political control.
You said this, in your judgment, is the big story of our time.
It is the big story of our time. It is, I would say, the red thread that runs through the history of the last 3 decades. It's how we had deregulation, financialization of the economy, the Wall Street bust, the erosion of our civil liberties, and perpetual war.
You write that the secret and unaccountable deep state floats freely above the gridlock between both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue is the paradox of American government in the 21st century.
Indeed, as leaked documents by the FBI reveal, this shadow government, also referred to as the Seventh Floor Group, essentially runs our government out of Washington, D.C. And as the WikiLeaks data concerning the CIA's tapping into all of our electronic devices reveals, everything we're doing is being watched by government eyes. To be precise, however, There are two shadow governments that call the shots behind the scenes. The first shadow government, referred to as COG, or continuity of government, is made up of unelected individuals who have been appointed to run the government in the event of a catastrophe. COG is a phantom menace waiting for the right circumstances, a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, an economic meltdown, to bring it out of the shadows where it hides and operates. When and if COG takes over, the police state will transition to martial law. Yet it's the second shadow government, also referred to as the deep state, that poses the greater threat to freedom at this time. Comprised of unelected government bureaucrats, spies, corporations, contractors, paper pushers, and button pushers who are actually calling the shots behind the scenes. This government within a government is the real reason we the people have no real control over our so-called government. The deep state, which operates according to its own secret agenda regardless of who is formally in power, makes a mockery of elections and the entire concept of a representative government. So who or what is the deep state? It's the militarized police, which have joined forces with state and federal law enforcement agencies in order to establish themselves as a standing army. It's the fusion centers and spy agencies that have created a total surveillance state and turned us all into suspects. It's the courthouses and prisons that have allowed corporate profits to take precedence over due process and justice. It's the military empire with its private contractors and defense industry that is bankrupting this country. It's the private sector with its 854,000 contract personnel with top secret clearances, incredibly a number greater than that of top secret cleared civilian employees of the government. It's what former congressional staffer Mike Lofgren refers to as, and I'm quoting here, a hybrid of national security and law enforcement agencies. This is comprised of the Department of Defense, the State Department, Homeland Security, the CIA, the Justice Department, the Treasury, the Executive Office of the President by way of the National Security Council, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, a handful of vital federal trial courts, and members of the Defense and Intelligence Committees. It's every facet of a government that is no longer friendly to freedom, and it's working overtime to trample the Constitution underfoot and render the citizenry powerless in the face of the government's power grabs, corruption, and abusive tactics. These are the key players that drive the shadow government. This is the hidden face of the American police state. Just consider some of the key programs and policies advanced by the shadow government that pulls the strings to the puppet show we call the government. Domestic surveillance. The National Security Agency, or NSA, the CIA, FBI, and so on, with their multi-billion-dollar black op budgets, conduct surveillance on every person in the United States who uses a computer or phone. Thus, on any given day, whether you're walking through a store, driving your car, checking your email, or talking to friends and family on the phone, you can be sure that some government agency is listening in and tracking your behavior. Local police have been outfitted with a litany of surveillance gear, from license plate readers and cell phone tracking devices to biometric data recorders. Technology now makes it possible for the police to scan passers-by in order to detect the contents of their pockets, purses, briefcases, and so on. Full-body scanners which perform virtual strip searches of Americans traveling by plane have gone mobile, with roving police vans that peer into vehicles and buildings alike, including homes. Coupled with the nation's growing network of real-time surveillance cameras and facial recognition software, soon there will really be nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. In fact, that day may have already arrived. Global spying. The NSA's massive surveillance network, what the Washington Post refers to as a $500 billion espionage empire, spans the globe and targets every single person on the planet who uses a phone or computer. The NSA's Echelon program intercepts and analyzes virtually every phone call, fax, and email message sent anywhere in the world. In addition to carrying out domestic surveillance on peaceful political groups such as Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and several religious groups, Echelon has also been a vital component in the government's attempts at political and corporate espionage. Roving TSA searches. The American taxpayer routinely gets ripped off by government agencies in the dubious name of national security. One of the greatest culprits when it comes to swindling taxpayers has been the Transportation Security Agency, or the TSA, with its questionable deployment of and complete mismanagement of millions of dollars worth of airport full-body X-ray scanners, punitive pat-downs by TSA agents, and the theft of travelers' valuables. Then there's the U.S. Patriot Act and the NDAA. America's so-called war on terror, which the government has relentlessly pursued since 9/11, continues to chip away at our freedoms, unravel our Constitution, and transform our nation into a battlefield, thanks in large part to such subversive legislation as the U.S. Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA. The NDAA actually empowers the president to label someone an extremist and have them taken away to a detention camp where they will not have access to an attorney or be able to see their family. These laws completely circumvent the rule of law and the rights of American citizens. In so doing, they reorient our legal landscape in such a way as to ensure that martial law, rather than the U.S. Constitution, is the roadmap by which we navigate life in the United States. The militarized police state. Thanks to federal grant programs allowing the Pentagon to transfer surplus military supplies and weapons to local law enforcement agencies without charge, police forces have been transformed from peace officers into heavily armed extensions of the military, complete with jackboots, helmets, shields, batons, pepper spray, stun guns, assault rifles, body armor, miniature tanks, and weaponized drones. As such, the police have been given the green light to probe, poke, pinch, taser, search, seize, strip, and generally manhandle anyone they see fit in almost any circumstance, all with the general blessing of the courts. SWAT team raids. More than 80,000 SWAT team raids are carried out every year on unsuspecting Americans by local police for relatively routine police matters. Federal agencies, such as the Department of Education and the Smithsonian, are also equipped with their own militarized police squads. In the process, the incidence of botch raids and related casualties continue to rise. Nationwide, SWAT teams continue to be employed to address an astonishingly trivial array of criminal activity or mere community nuisances, including angry dogs, domestic disputes, improper paperwork filed by an orchid farmer, good example, misdemeanor marijuana possession, and overdue educational loans. As a result, innocent American citizens, including children, are being injured and even killed. Domestic drones. The domestic use of drones continues unabated. As mandated by Congress, soon there will be 30,000 drones crisscrossing the skies of America, all part of an industry that could be worth as much as $30 billion per year. These machines, which will be equipped with weapons, will be able to record all activities using video feeds, heat sensors, and radar. An Inspector General report reveals that the Department of Justice has already spent nearly $4 million on drones domestically, largely for use by the FBI, with grants for another $1.3 million so that police departments and other government agencies can acquire their own drones. The school-to-prison pipeline. A compliant citizenry is now an important element of the deep state controllers. Unfortunately, abject compliance to the state is taught by example in the schools, through school lockdowns where police and drug-sniffing dogs enter the classroom, and zero-tolerance policies that punish all offenses equally and result in young people being expelled for childish behavior. School districts now team up with local law enforcement to create what's called a schoolhouse-to-jailhouse track by imposing a double dose of punishment, suspension or expulsion from school, accompanied by an arrest by the police and a trip to juvenile court and/or prison. Overcriminalization. The government bureaucracy churns out laws, statutes, and codes and regulations that reinforce its powers and value systems and those of the police state and its corporate allies, rendering the rest of us petty criminals. The average American now unknowingly commits 3 felonies a day thanks to this overabundance of vague laws that render otherwise innocent activity illegal. Consequently, small farmers who dare to make unpasteurized goat cheese and share it with members of their community have their farms raided. And America's prison population, the largest in the world, continues to grow. And finally, there's the endless wars. America's expanding military empire is bleeding the country dry at a rate of more than $15 billion a month or $20 million an hour. The Pentagon spends more on war than all 50 states combined spend on health, education, welfare, and safety. Yet what most Americans fail to recognize is that these ongoing wars have little to do with keeping the country safe and everything to do with enriching the military-industrial complex at taxpayer expense. Are you getting the message yet? Our so-called representatives in Washington are little more than figureheads, puppets, to entertain and distract the populace from what's really going on.
The Trojan horse was the earliest recorded military psyop. The lesson of the story, recorded in the counsel to "Beware Greeks bearing gifts," is that we should not let down our defenses when an erstwhile enemy offers us aid. Today, that counsel is as useful as ever, but today's tricksters have donned the mantle of philanthropy, and their Trojan horses are not wooden statues, but non-governmental organizations offering aid to foreign nations. The bitter truth is that in a surprising number of cases, NGOs are the deep state's Trojan horses. This is the Corbett Report. In 2015, Kyrgyzstan made what might seem at first glance to be a surprising move. It canceled a cooperation treaty with the US that had been in place since 1993. The treaty granted tax breaks and customs privileges to organizations like the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and gave their workers diplomatic immunity in the country. All of that came to an end after the U.S. granted a human rights award to Azimyan Askarov, an activist swept up and thrown in jail for creating a threat to civil peace and stability in society after the Uzbek riots in South Kyrgyzstan in 2010. Reaction from the usual Western outlets was swift and predictable. Kyrgyzstan has lost its mind. Or, to be more precise, it's all Putin's fault. Somehow. But don't worry, the US will continue aiding Kyrgyzstan anyway, whether they like it or not, because that's just how they roll. Go Team America! But Kyrgyzstan is not the only country to crack down on aid from foreign NGOs. In the last few years, a series of countries, including Russia, China, and India, have passed laws placing stricter controls on the operations of these organizations within their borders.
Well, Russia is throwing the smackdown on poor little old NGOs, these charitable organizations that were set up. The reasoning behind them, that they might be trying to take down the Kremlin. The Kremlin is moving to ban the U.S.-backed MacArthur Foundation, George Soros' Open Society Institute, and 10 other foreign groups, calling them unwelcome organizations by law. They're also mulling over something called a patriotic stop list. Anyone caught collaborating with these groups, they're facing 6 years in prison.
China has passed the country's first law regulating overseas NGOs or non-governmental organizations.
The Chinese government always welcomes foreign NGOs to come to China to expand cultural and charity activities, and their achievements are highly spoken of by the Chinese authorities. But there are a few illegal exceptions in which NGOs came to China to harm its national security.
The law covers activities of NGOs founded outside the Chinese mainland. They must register with public security authorities and declare where their funding is coming from.
India has placed Ford Foundation on a watch list and ordered all funds from the US-based non-profit organization to be routed to recipients only after the Home Ministry's approval. Citing national security concerns, the Home Ministry has asked the Reserve Bank of India to ensure funds given by Ford Foundation to Indian recipients be brought to its notice and dispersed only after its clearance. The ministry said in its order that it wanted to ensure funds coming from Ford Foundation were utilized for bona fide welfare activities without compromising on concerns of national interest and security.
An Egyptian court has convicted 43 Egyptian and 16 American NGO workers for working illegally in Egypt while encouraging unrest. The defendants, who were mostly absent from court, were sentenced to up to 5 years in jail. The verdict calls for the closing of U.S. nonprofit groups, such as the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute and Freedom House, which back in 2012, Egypt accused of receiving illegal funding and operating without licenses.
So what on earth is going on? Why are all of these countries kicking out all of these US-based non-governmental and quasi-governmental entities? Why would they be opposed to charity and aid? The answer is not difficult to understand. These organizations are Trojan horses, designed to appear as gifts, but containing secret trap doors through which hidden forces can enter the country and covertly undermine the governments in question. This explanation only sounds outlandish to those who look no further than the organization's names and have no idea of their history of operations. Take USAID, for example. Created in 1961 by executive order, it's a US government agency that seeks to end extreme poverty and to promote resilient democratic societies while advancing our security and prosperity. So why did President Morales kick them out of Bolivia in 2013? Because he's crazy and irrational? Or because USAID ran a program through its remarkably frankly named Office of Transition Initiatives that provided $10.5 million of funding for strengthening democratic institutions throughout the country, including in opposition stronghold areas? Was it paranoia on Morales' part? Or merely the recognition that mealy-mouthed rhetoric about strengthening democratic institutions is a thinly veiled euphemism for overthrowing the government, exactly as leaked diplomatic documents proved was the case for USAID's identically named program in Venezuela?
USAID was originally an agency created to provide humanitarian aid and disaster relief to countries in need. And throughout the 1980s and the 1990s and more into the 21st century, it's evolved into a political arm and a funding branch of the U.S. government for what they call promoting democracy. And it's actually now a part of U.S. counterinsurgency campaigns that involve the Pentagon, the State Department in terms of diplomacy and obviously war activities, and USAID is the third agency involved in counterinsurgency, and their goal precisely is to provide what they called aid for promoting democracy or stabilizing or helping a country through some kind of political transition or economic transition. In the case of Venezuela, Venezuela is a country that is oil wealthy, so it's never qualified for any kind of direct USAID help. Therefore, USAID has never had an office here officially, and they didn't actually come to the country and set up an office until 2002, right before the coup d'etat against President Chavez. And the documents, internal documents obtained under Freedom of Information Act reveal that the sole intention of setting up the office here in Venezuela was to aid opposition forces to eventually oust Chavez from power.
Should governments trust USAID after it was revealed that the agency secretly created its own social media network in Cuba for the express purpose of undermining the Castro government? Or when it was revealed that USAID had sent a team of agents to Cuba under the guise of health and civic programs to incite rebellion amongst youth, including creating a phony HIV prevention workshop that the agency itself described as the perfect excuse to identify potential social change actors? Or when it was revealed that the agency had attempted, and miserably failed, to infiltrate Cuba's hip-hop scene, to break the information blockade, and spark a youth movement of social change in the country?
A U.S. agency infiltrated the Cuban hip-hop world in an attempt to launch a youth movement against the government there. The secret operation tried to use Cuban rappers to build a network of young people seeking social change. But the Cuban regime caught on and the operation failed. In the process, the U.S. Agency for International Development unintentionally compromised a vibrant music culture that produced hard-hitting grassroots criticism of the country. Several artists at the agency tried to promote ended up leaving Cuba or stopped performing after pressure from the government.
In fact, USAID's Black Ops programs for undermining foreign governments go all the way back to the founding of the agency itself. Some of the lowlights include USAID's Office of Public Safety and its part in running a CIA front program for training foreign police in torture and terror tactics in Latin America, co-funding, with the CIA, the opium-smuggling Shengquang Air Transport, a private airline for narcotics trafficker and CIA point man in Laos, General Vang Pao, and co-funding opposition groups in Ukraine prior to the 2014 coup, with Glenn Greenwald backer Pierre Omidyar, and, of course, George Soros.
George Soros, pleasure to have you on.
Same here.
First on Ukraine, one of the things that many people recognized about you was that you, during the revolutions of 1989, funded a lot of dissident activity, civil society groups in Eastern Europe, in Poland, the Czech Republic. Are you doing similar things in Ukraine?
Well, I set up a foundation in Ukraine before Ukraine became independent of Russia. And the foundation has been functioning ever since. And it played an important part in events now.
But this NGO Trojan horse problem is by no means confined to USAID and its associated organizations. Take the National Endowment for Democracy as another example. The official story is that the NED was created in 1983 by an act of Congress in order to encourage the establishment and growth of democratic development in target countries around the world in line with US foreign policy goals. The actual story is that the NED was created expressly as a front for funding CIA activities inside target countries.
The National Endowment for Democracy, really that's kind of heir to what we used to call the Covert Action Staff, the CIA. They fund all kinds of people who do color revolution type things, okay? And we know of about 65 projects that the National Endowment for Democracy had going in Ukraine.
A fact that Alan Weinstein, one of the members of the study group that led to the NED's founding, openly bragged about in the Washington Post. A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA, he was quoted as saying. Even more blatant is an admission by then-Director of Central Intelligence William Casey, who wrote a memo to the White House advocating for the creation of NED, but cautioning that we here at the CIA should not get out front in the development of such an organization, nor do we wish to appear to be a sponsor or advocate. The NED's participation in covert destabilization campaigns rivals that of USAID, and, like USAID, involves too many operations to detail them all here. Lowlights include bankrolling the Project Democracy program that became the core of Oliver North's secret government during the Iran-Contra years, manipulating the elections in Nicaragua in 1990 to oust Ortega and the Sandinistas, overthrowing the government of Bulgaria in 1990 and Albania in 1991, and backing every major color revolution of the modern period, from the Rose Revolution in Georgia to the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan and Orange Revolution in Ukraine a decade ago, to the recent, unsuccessful Electric Yerevan in Armenia, and many others in between.
What about Ukraine? I understand there are a few organizations that have been involved in Ukraine trying to disturb that government. Of course, we have visited on this subject quite a bit, but I didn't realize how much the NED is involved over there.
And this is a big issue because I think the argument could definitely be made that NATO should have ended after the Cold War, but definitely the National Endowment for Democracy should have been ended after the Cold War. Instead, they say, like with every government program, no, now's the time we need more. But in Ukraine, just this past year, this is an interesting article written by the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. He's president for life. Karl Gershman. I know this might shock you, but he's actually a Trotskyite. He was a founder and member of a communist breakaway party, Trotskyite Social Democrats USA. He wrote an editorial in the Washington Post September of 13, just before the events happened in Ukraine. And he wrote, as the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, he said, Ukraine is the biggest prize.
Yeah.
And he mentioned that Ukraine's choice to join Europe will accelerate the demise of the ideology of Russian imperialism that Putin represents, and Putin may find himself on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, but within Russia itself. So his real goal is regime change. He spelled it out just before all of these events took place.
Now,
these types of Trojan horse operations have been used hundreds of times in the past, and there is no sign that the deep state is ready to abandon the trick now. Quite the opposite. It worked during the Arab Spring, when even the New York Times blithely admitted that the leaders of the protests had received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House. And the State Department blithely admitted that they spent $50 million helping activists in the region network, communicate, and organize with each other through Trojan horse NGOs like movements.org. The deception also worked in Syria, where leaked documents proved the US had been providing millions of dollars of support to opposition groups in the country since 2006 through a variety of Trojan horse NGOs like the Movement for Justice and Development. And as we saw earlier this year in The White Helmets Are a Propaganda Construct, even first responder groups like the Syria Civil Defense, founded by an ex-British military intelligence officer, have been used as Trojan horses to spread propaganda and advance the agenda of the US and its allies in their quest to topple President Assad. Let's be clear. This is not to say that all NGOs are Trojan horses. It is not the case that every group or program that receives money from US aid or the National Endowment for Democracy or a similar organization is thereby automatically a deep state change agent. That is not how the Trojan horse technique works. No, what makes these NGOs so effective as disguises for regime change operations is that much of the time, they are doing what they claim to be doing, providing aid, assistance, and charity where it is needed. It is for this very reason that the US and its allies can so effectively smear NGO skeptics as crazy. But consider this. In 1938, the US Congress passed the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. With the notable exception of AIPAC, NGOs, lobby groups, and individuals who are representing a foreign agent are required to register under the Act and are subjected to greater scrutiny of financial records and other activities. The irony is that FARA is essentially the same type of legislation that has recently been passed in China, but when the Chinese do it, it's craziness. When the US did it 70 years ago, it was just good common sense. Once again, the hypocrisy is evident for those who wish to see it. If there is any good to come out of this, it is that the public is increasingly aware of these types of covert activities. Perhaps more to the point, victims of these operations are now more willing to stand up to the US and suffer its potential diplomatic wrath by scrutinizing, monitoring, watchlisting, regulating, or even kicking out these agents of chaos.
This is not your mother's FBI. What's wrong with the FBI is not the average everyday agent. They're great. It's the management at the FBI that is the problem.
Talk about the wolf guarding the henhouse. Peter Strzok, FBI deputy and Russia expert, was recently fired from the Trump collusion investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller. Strzok also led the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server. We now know Strzok changed the language describing Clinton's criminal actions as grossly negligent to the softer legalese of extremely careless. Strzok was assigned to the task of interviewing Hillary Clinton, Huma Abedin, and Cheryl Mills. His notes claim that the women denied knowing anything about Hillary's secret server, despite emails proving otherwise. Strzok essentially watered down all of the evidence surrounding Hillary's illegal server, and then was the agent responsible for questioning Michael Flynn.
But you have to ask yourself, given the history of everybody involved in that case, who were involved in the Hillary email server case, where they conducted a totally irresponsible, unprofessional criminal investigation, and then they turn up the heat on this investigation of Flynn, the same agency. This is politics. The Bureau has been politicized.
The Justice Department recently verified that Strzok had been exchanging emails insulting President Trump and was engaging in an extramarital affair with Mueller's trial lawyer, Lisa Page. And that was enough controversy to have Strzok moved to a human resources desk where Devin Nunes pestered Strzok for an interview.
All we were doing was sending two of our investigators down there to begin to go through the documents to ensure that the documents that we had subpoenaed were provided. When my investigators got there, there were four other staff from the other side of the aisle, including a member of Congress, the ranking member from our committee, which seems to me to be very bizarre behavior since
Adam Schiff was there. Adam Schiff was there. Two Nancy Pelosi staffers were there, correct?
Yeah, so I think here's the bizarre part of it. They didn't support the subpoena. They said there was no reason to see this documentation. So I don't know why they would run down there and be the first people to review the information.
What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that they're very, very nervous.
Nunes told the Daily Caller, this is part of a months-long pattern by the DOJ and FBI of stonewalling and obstructing the committee's oversight work, particularly oversight of their use of the Steele dossier. Unfortunately, Strzok is just one of the Democrats fueling Mueller's witch hunt. The Daily Caller reports at least 9 of Mueller's prosecutors have donated to Democratic political candidates, and all of the legal actions taken so far in Mueller's investigation have involved pro-Democrat prosecutors. The lawyers working the money laundering case against former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his associate Rick Yates have donated to Obama's presidential campaigns. Strzok is the face of the infiltration of the deep state upon the federal government, a big clue revealing the hordes of Obama and Hillary Clinton loyalists working to undermine the highest office in the land.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming out. We have at least 19 members of Congress who will be introducing today a 12-page House resolution detailing misconduct at the highest levels of the Department of Justice and Federal Bureau of Investigation. It will be outlining FISA abuse, how and why the Hillary Clinton email probe ended, and how and why the Trump-Russia probe began. This resolution also calls for the appointment of a second special counsel to investigate the gross misconduct, with the understanding that the Justice Department cannot be expected to investigate itself.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right.
Yes. I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all.
When the Nazis occupied Budapest in 1944, George Soros' father was a successful lawyer. He lived on an island in the Danube and liked to commute to work in a rowboat. But knowing there were problems ahead for the Jews, he decided to split his family up. He bought them forged papers, and he bribed a government official to take 14-year-old George Soros in and swear that he was his Christian godson. But survival carried a heavy price tag. While hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being shipped off to the death camps, George Soros accompanied his phony godfather on his appointed rounds, confiscating property from the Jews.
Somebody else would be taking it away anyhow, so I had no sense of guilt.
Are you religious?
No. I don't feel guilty because I'm engaged in an amoral activity which is not meant to have anything to do with guilt, because we find it more convenient to operate without it.
This is Mr. George Soros, and he's going to be helping.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed witness.
We came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, oh, I'm sure it did. They're going to be captured or killed.
Democratic Jewish state between Israel and the United States.
The desert is blooming again, and we can be so proud. We need people like George Soros, who is fearless and willing to step up when it counts.
Nearly half of your financial sector donations appear to come from just two wealthy financiers, George Soros and Donald Sussman.
You're referring to a super PAC that we don't coordinate with, that was set up to support President Obama, that has now decided they want to support me. They are the ones who should respond to any questions. Let's talk about our campaigns.
There is a storm coming. We have not forgotten. We will never forget. No shelter, no deals. Never again.
You guys know what this represents? Well, maybe it's the calm before the storm.
What's the storming?
Could be the calm before the storm.
What storm, Mr. President?